The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Night Time. A novel by Mark Haddon. Chapter 211. Then I wondered whether I should have got off the train, because it had just stopped at London, and I was scared because if the train went anywhere else, it would be somewhere where I didn't know anybody. And then somebody went to the toilet, and then they came out again, but they didn't see me. And I could smell their poo, and it was different from the smell of the poo that I smelled in the toilet when I went in there. And then I closed my eyes and did some more maths puzzles, so I didn't think about where I was going. And then the train stopped again, and I thought about getting off the shelf and going to get my bag and get off the train. But I didn't want to be found by the policeman and be taken to father, so I stayed on the shelf and didn't move, and no one saw me this time. And then I remembered that there was a map on the wall of one of the classrooms at school, and it was a map of England and Scotland and Wales, and it showed you where all the towns were, and I pictured it in my head with Swindon and London on it. And it was like this in my head. And I had been looking at my watch since the train had started at 12:59 p.m, and the first stop had been at 1:16 p.m, which was 17 minutes later. And it was now 1:39 p.m, which was 23 minutes after the stop, which meant that we would be at the sea if the train didn't go in a big curve. But I didn't know if it went in a big curve. And then there were another 4 stops, and 4 people came and took bags away from the shelves, and 2 people put bags on the shelves, but no one moved the big suitcase that was in front of me. And only one person saw me, and they said, "You're fucking weird, mate." And that was a man in a suit. And 6 people went to the toilet, but they didn't do poos that I could smell, which was good. And then the train stopped, and a lady with a yellow waterproof coat came and took the big suitcase away, and she said, "Have you touched this?" And I said, "Yes." And then she went away. And then a man stood next to the shelf and said, "Come and look at this, Barry. They've got like a train elf." And another man came and stood next to him and said, "Well, we have both been drinking." And the first man said, "Perhaps we should feed him some nuts." And the second man said, "You're the one who's bloody nuts." And the first one said, "Come on, shift it, you daft cunt. I need more beers before I sober up." And then they went away. And then the train was really quiet and it didn't move again, and I couldn't hear anyone. So I decided to get off the shelf and go and get my bag and see if the policeman was still sitting in his seat. So I got off the shelf and looked through the door, but the policeman wasn't there. And my bag had gone as well, which had Toby's food in it and my maths books and my clean pants and vest and shirt and the orange juice and the milk and the custard creams and the baked beans. And then I heard the sound of feet, and I turned round and it was another policeman, not the one who was on the train before, and I could see him through the door in the next carriage, and he was looking under the seats. And I decided that I didn't like policemen so much anymore, so I got off the train. And when I saw how big the room was that the train was in, and I heard how noisy and echoey it was, I had to kneel down on the ground for a bit, because I thought I was going to fall over. And when I was kneeling on the ground, I worked out which way to walk, and I decided to walk in the direction the train was going when it came into the station, because if this was the last stop, that was the direction London was in. So I stood up and I imagined that there was a big red line on the ground which ran parallel to the train, to the gate at the far end, and I walked along it and I said, left, right, again, like before. And when I got to the gate, a man said to me, "I think someone's looking for you, sonny." And I said, "Who's looking for me?" Because I thought it might be Mother, and the policeman in Swindon had phoned her with the phone number I told him. But he said, "A policeman?" And I said, "I know." And he said, "All right." And then he said, "You wait here then, I'll go tell him." And he walked back down the side of the train. So I carried on walking, and I could still feel the feeling like a balloon inside my chest, and it hurt, and I covered my ears with my hands, and I went and stood against the wall of a little shop which said, "Hotel and Theatre Reservations." tell 0207 402 5164 in the middle of the big room. And then I took my hands away from my ears, and I groaned to block out the noise, and I looked around the big room at all the signs to see if this was London. And the signs said, but after a few seconds, they looked like this. Because there were too many and my brain wasn't working properly. And this frightened me. So I closed my eyes again and I counted slowly to 50, but without doing the cubes. And I stood there and I opened my Swiss Army knife in my pocket to make me feel safe, and I held onto it tight. And then I made my hand into a little tube with my fingers, and I opened my eyes and I looked through the tube so that I was only looking at one sign at a time. And after a long time, I saw a sign that said, I, information, and it was above a window on a little shop. And a man came up to me, and he was wearing a blue jacket and blue trousers, and he had brown shoes, and he was carrying a book in his hand, and he said, You look lost. So I took out my Swiss Army knife, and he said, Whoa, 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 and held up both hands with his fingers stretched out in a fan, like he wanted me to stretch my fingers out in a fan and touch his fingers because he wanted to say he loved me. But he did it with both hands, not one like father and mother, and I didn't know who he was. And then he walked away backward. So I went to the shop that said, I, information, and I could feel my heart beating very hard, and I could hear a noise like the sea in my ears. And when I got to the window, I said, Is this London? But there was no one behind the window. And then someone sat behind the window, and she was a lady, and she was black, and she had long fingernails which were painted pink, and I said, Is this London? And she said, Sure is, honey. And I said, Is this London? And she said, Indeed it is. And I said, How do I get to 451C Chapter Road, London, NW2 5NG? And she said, Where is that? And I said, It's 451C Chapter Road, London, NW2 5NG. And sometimes you can write it 451C Chapter Road, Willesden, London, NW2 5NG. And the lady said to me, Take the tube to Willesden Junction, honey, or Willesden Green. Got to be near there somewhere. And I said, What sort of tube? And she said, Are you for real? And I didn't say anything. And she said, Over there. See that big suitcase with the escalators? See the sign? Says Underground. Take the Bakerloo line to Willesden Junction, or the Jubilee to Willesden Green. You okay, honey? And I looked where she was pointing, and there was a big staircase going down into the ground, and there was a big sign over the top of it, like this. And I thought, I can do this, because I was doing really well, and I was in London, and I would find my mother. And I had to think to myself, the people are like cows in a field, and I just had to look in front of me all the time and make a red line along the floor in the picture of the big room in my head and follow it. And I walked across the big room to the escalators, and I kept hold of my Swiss Army knife in my pocket, and I held on to Toby in my other hand to make sure he didn't escape. And the escalators was a staircase, but it was moving, and people stepped onto it, and it carried them down and up, and it made me laugh because I hadn't been on one before, and it was like something in a science fiction film about the future. But I didn't want to use it, so I went down the stairs instead. And then I was in a smaller room underground, and there were lots of people, and there were pillars which had blue lights in the ground around the bottom of them. And I liked these, but I didn't like the people. So I saw a photo booth like one I went into 25th of March 1994 to have my passport photo done. And I went into the photo booth because it was like a cupboard, and it felt safer, and I could look out through the curtain. And I did detecting by watching, and I saw that people were putting tickets into grey gates and walking through, and some of them were buying tickets at big black machines on the wall. And I watched 47 people do this, and I memorized what to do. Then I imagined a red line on the floor, and I walked over to the wall where there was a poster which was a list of places to go, and it was alphabetical. And I saw Wilston Green, and it said £2.20. And then I went to one of the machines, and there was a little screen which said, Press ticket type. And I pressed the button that most people had pressed, which was adult single and £2.20. And the screen said, Insert £2.20. And I put three £1 coins into the slot, and there was a clinking noise, and the screen said, Take ticket and change. And there was a ticket in a little hole at the bottom of the machine, and a 50p coin and a 20p coin and a 10p coin. And I put the coins in my pocket, and I went up to one of the grey gates, and I put my ticket into the slot, and it sucked it in, and it came out on the other side of the gate. And someone said, Get a move on! And I made the noise like a dog barking, and I walked forward, and the gate opened this time, and I took my ticket like other people did, and I liked the grey gate because it was like something in a science fiction film about the future too. And then I had to work out which way to go. So I stood against a wall so people didn't touch me, and there was a sign for Bakerloo Line and District and Circle Line, but not one for Jubilee Line like the lady had said. So I made a plan, and it was to go to Willesden Junction on the Bakerloo Line. And there was another sign for Bakerloo Line, and it was like this. And I read all the words, and I found Willesden Junction. So I followed the sign that said, and I went through the left-hand tunnel, and there was a fence down the middle of the tunnel, and the people were walking straight ahead on the left and coming the other way on the right, like on a road. So I walked along the left, and the tunnel curved left, and then there were more gates, and a sign said Bakerloo Line, and it pointed down an escalator. So I had to go down the escalators, and I had to hold on to the rubber rail, but that moved too, so I didn't fall over, and people were standing close to me, and I wanted to hit them to make them go away, but I didn't hit them because of the caution. And then I was at the bottom of the escalators, and I had to jump off, and I tripped and bumped into someone, and they said, Easy! And there were two ways to go, and one said northbound, and I went that way because Wilston was on the top half of the map, and the top is always north on maps. And then I was in another train station, but it was tiny, and it was in a tunnel, and there was only one track, and the walls were curved, and they were covered in big adverts, and they said, Way Out, and London's Transport Museum, and Take Time Out to Regret Your Career Choice, and Jamaica, and British Rail, and No Smoking, and Be Moved, and Be Moved, and Be Moved, and for stations beyond Queen's Park, take the first train and change at Queen's Park if necessary, and Hammersmith and City Line, and You're Closer Than My Family Ever Gets. And there were lots of people standing in the little station, and it was underground, so there weren't any windows, and I didn't like that. So I found a seat, which was a bench, and I sat at the end of the bench. And then lots of people started coming into the little station, and someone sat down on the other end of the bench, and it was a lady who had a black briefcase and purple shoes and a brooch shaped like a parrot. And the people kept coming into the little station, so that it was even more crowded than the big station. And then I couldn't see the walls anymore, and the back of someone's jacket touched my knee, and I felt sick, and I started groaning really loudly, and the lady on the bench stood up, and no one else sat down. And I felt like when I had flu, and I had to stay in bed all day, and all of me hurt, and I couldn't walk or eat or go to sleep or do maths. And then there was a sound like people fighting with swords, and I could feel a strong wind, and a roaring started, and I closed my eyes, and the roaring got louder, and I groaned really loudly, but I couldn't block it out of my ears, and I thought the little station was going to collapse, or there was a big fire somewhere, and I was going to die. And then the roaring turned into a clattering and a squealing, and it got slowly quieter, and then it stopped, and I kept my eyes closed because I felt safer not seeing what was happening. And then I could hear people moving again because it was quieter. And I opened my eyes and I couldn't see anything at first because there were too many people. And then I saw that they were getting onto a train that wasn't there before. And it was the train which was the roaring. And there was sweat running down my face from under my hair, and I was moaning, not groaning, but different, like a dog when it has hurt its paw. And I heard the sound, but I didn't realize it was me at first. And then the train doors closed, and the train started moving, and it roared again, but not as loud this time. And 5 carriages went past, and it went into the tunnel at the end of the little station, and it was quiet again, and the people were all walking into the tunnels that went out of the little station. And I was shaking, and I wanted to be back at home, and then I realized I couldn't be at home because Father was there, and he told a lie, and he killed Wellington, which meant that it wasn't my home anymore. My home was 451C Chapter Road, London NW2 5NG, and it scared me having a wrong thought like, I wish I was back at home again, because it meant my mind wasn't working properly. And then more people came into the little station, and it became fuller, and then the roaring began again, and I closed my eyes and I sweated and felt sick, and I felt like feeling like a balloon, that feeling like a balloon inside my chest, and it was so big I found it hard to breathe. And then the people went away on the train, and the little station was empty again. And then it filled up with people, and another train came with the same roaring. And it was exactly like having flu that time because I wanted it to stop, like you can just pull the plug of a computer out of the wall if it crashes, because I wanted to go to sleep so I wouldn't have to think, because the only thing I couldn't think was how much it hurt, because there was no room for anything else in my head. But I couldn't go to sleep, and I just had to sit there, and there was nothing to do except to wait and to hurt. Chapter 223. And this is another description, because Siobhan said I should do descriptions. And it is a description of the advert that was on the wall of the little train station opposite me. But I can't remember all of it, because I thought I was going to die. And the advert said, Dream Holiday, Think Kuoni, in Malaysia. And behind the writing there was a big photograph of 2 orangutans, and they were swinging on branches. And there were trees behind them, but the leaves were blurred because the camera was focusing on the orangutans and not the leaves, and the orangutans were moving. And orangutan comes from the Malaysian word orang hutan, which means man of the woods, but orang hutan isn't Malaysian for orangutan. And adverts are pictures or television programs to make you buy things like cars or Snickers or use an internet service provider. And this was an advert to make you go to Malaysia on holiday. And Malaysia is in Southeast Asia, and it is made up of Peninsular Malaysia and Sabah and Sarawak and Labuan, and the capital is Kuala Lumpur, and the highest mountain is Mount Kinabalu, which is 4,101 meters high, and that wasn't on the advert. And Siobhan says that people go on holidays to see new things and relax, but it wouldn't make me relaxed, and you can see new things by looking at Earth under a microscope, or drawing the shape of the solid made when 3 circular rods of equal thickness intersect at right angles. And I think that there are so many things just in one house that it would take years to think about all of them properly. And also, a thing is interesting because of thinking about it, and not because of being new. For example, Siobhan showed me that you can wet your finger and rub the edge of a thin glass and make a singing noise. And you can put different amounts of water in different glasses, and they make different notes because they have what are called different resonant frequencies. And you can play a tune like 3 Blind Mice. And lots of people have thin glasses in their houses, and they don't know you can do this. And the advert said, Malaysia, truly Asia. Stimulated by the sights and smells, you realize that you have arrived in a land of contrasts. You seek out the traditional, the natural, and the cosmopolitan. Your memories stretch from city days to nature reserves to lazy hours on the beach. Prices from £575 per person. Call us on 01306 747 000. See your travel agent or visit the world at www.kuoni.co.uk. A world of difference. And there were three other pictures, and they were very small, and they were a palace and a beach and a palace. And this is what the orangutans looked like. Chapter 227. And I kept my eyes closed, and I didn't look at my watch at all. And the trains coming in and out of the station were in a rhythm, like music or drumming. And it was like counting and saying left, right, left, right, which Siobhan taught me to do to make myself calm. And I was saying in my head, train coming, train stopped, train going, silence, train coming, train stopped, train going, as if the trains were only in my mind. And normally I don't imagine things that aren't happening, because it is a lie and it makes me feel scared. But it was better than watching the trains coming in and out of the station, because it made me feel even more scared. And I didn't open my eyes, and I didn't look at my watch. And it was like being in a dark room with the curtains closed, so I couldn't see anything, like when you wake up at night and the only sounds you hear are the sounds inside your head. And that made it better, because it was like the little station wasn't there, outside my head. But I was in bed and I felt safe. And then the silences between the trains coming and going got longer and longer. And I could hear that there were fewer people in the little station when the train wasn't there. So I opened my eyes and I looked at my watch and it said 8:07 p.m. And I had been sitting on the bench for approximately 5 hours, but it hadn't seemed like approximately 5 hours, except that my bottom hurt and I was hungry and thirsty. And then I realized that Toby was missing because he was not in my pocket. And I didn't want him to be missing because we weren't in father's house or mother's house, and there wasn't anyone to feed him in the little station, and he would die, and he might get run over by a train. And then I looked up at the ceiling, and I saw that there was a long black box, which was a sign, and it said, Harrow and Wealdstone 2 minutes, Queen's Park 7 minutes. And then the bottom line scrolled up and disappeared, and a different line scrolled up into its place, and the sign said, 1. Harrow and Wealdstone 1 minute, 2. Wealdstone Junction 4 minutes. And then it changed again and it said, 1. Harrow and Wealdstone, stand back train approaching. And then I heard the sound like sword fighting and the roaring of a train coming into the station, and I worked out that there was a big computer somewhere, and it knew where all the stations were, and it sent messages to the black boxes in the little station to say that the trains were coming, and that made me feel better, because everything had an order and a plan. And the train came into the little station, and it stopped, and 5 people got onto the train, and another person ran into the little station and got on, and 7 people got off the train, and then the doors closed automatically, and the train went away. And when the next train came, I wasn't so scared anymore, because the sign said, train approaching, so I knew it was going to happen. And then I decided that I would look for Toby, because there were only 3 people in the little station. So I stood up and I looked up and down the little station, and in the doorways that went into tunnels, but I couldn't see him anywhere. And then I looked down into the black lower down bit where the rails were. And then I saw 2 mice, and they were black because they were covered in dirt. And I liked that because I like mice and rats, but they weren't Toby, so I carried on looking. And then I saw Toby, and he was also in the lower down bit where the rails were, and I knew he was Toby because he was white and he had a brown egg shape on his back. So I climbed down off the concrete, and he was eating a bit of rubbish that was just an old sweet paper. And someone shouted, Jesus, what are you doing? And I bent down to catch Toby, but he ran off. And I walked after him, and I bent down again, and I said, Toby, Toby, Toby. And I held out my hand so that he could smell my hand and smell that it was me. And someone said, Get the fuck out of there, for fuck's sake! And I looked up, and it was a man who was wearing a green raincoat, and he had black shoes, and his socks were showing, and they were grey with little diamond patterns on them. And I said, Toby, Toby, but he ran off again. And the man with the diamond patterns on his socks tried to grab my shoulders, so I screamed. And then he heard the sound like sword fighting, and Toby started running again. But this time he ran the other way, which was past my feet, and I grabbed at him and I caught him by the tail. And the man with the diamond patterns on his socks said, Oh Christ! Oh Christ! And then I heard the roaring, and I lifted Toby up and grabbed him with both hands. And he bit me on my thumb, and there was blood coming out, and I shouted, and Toby tried to jump out of my hands. And then the roaring got louder, and I turned around and saw the train coming out of the tunnel, and I was going to be run over and killed. So I tried to climb up onto the concrete, but it was high, and I was holding Toby in both my hands. And then the man with the diamond patterns on his socks grabbed hold of me and pulled me, and I screamed. But he kept pulling me, and he pulled me up onto the concrete, and we fell over, and I carried on screaming because he had hurt my shoulder. And then the train came into the station, and I stood up, and I ran to the bench again, and I put Toby into the pocket inside my jacket, and he went very quiet, and he didn't move. And the man with the diamond patterns on his socks was standing next to me, and he said, What the fuck do you think you were playing at? But I didn't say anything, and he said, What were you doing? And the doors of the train opened, and people got off, and there was a lady standing behind the man with the diamond patterns on his socks, and she was carrying a guitar case like Siobhan has. And I said, I was finding Toby, he's my pet rat. And the man with the diamond patterns on his socks said, Fucking Nora. And the lady with the guitar case said, Is he okay? And the man with the diamond patterns on his socks said, Him? Thanks a fucking bundle, Jesus Christ, a pet rat. Oh shit, my train. And then he ran to the train and he banged on the door, which was closed, and the train started to go away, and he said, Fuck. And the lady said, Are you okay? And she touched my arm, so I screamed again, and she said, Okay, okay, okay. And there was a sticker on her guitar case, and it said, And I was sitting on the ground, and the woman knelt down on one knee, and she said, Is there anything I can do to help you? And if she was a teacher at school, I could have said, Where is 451C Chapter Road, Wilston, London, NW2 5NG? But she was a stranger, so I said, Stand further away, because I didn't like her being so close. And I said, I've got a Swiss Army knife, and it has a saw blade, and it could cut someone's fingers off. And she said, Okay, buddy, I'm going to take that as a no. And she stood up and walked away. And the man with the diamond patterns on his socks said, Mad as a fucking hatter, Jesus. And he was pressing a handkerchief against his face, and there was blood on the handkerchief. And then another train came, and the man with the diamond patterns on his socks and the lady with the guitar case got on, and it went away again. And then 8 more trains came, and I decided that I would get onto a train, and then I would work out what to do. So I got on the next train. And Toby tried to get out of my pocket, so I took hold of him, and I put him in my outside pocket, and I held him with my hand. And there were 11 people in the carriage, and I didn't like being in a room with 11 people in a tunnel. So I concentrated on things in the carriage. And there were signs saying, There are 53,963 holiday cottages in Scandinavia and Germany, and Vita Biotics, and 3435, and penalty £10 if you fail to show a valid ticket for your entire journey, and Discover Gold, then Bronze, and TVIC, and EPBIC, and Suck My Cock, and Obstructing the Doors Can Be Dangerous, and BRV, and Con IC, and Talk to the World. And there was a pattern on the walls which was like this. And there was a pattern on the seats like this. Then the train wobbled a lot, and I had to hang on to a rail, and we went into a tunnel, and it was noisy, and I closed my eyes, and I could feel the blood pumping in the side of my neck. And then we came out of the tunnel and went into another little station, and it was called Warwick Avenue, and it said in its big letters on the wall, and I liked that because you knew where you were. And I timed the distance between the stations all the way to Willesden Junction, and all the times between stations were multiples of 15 seconds, like this. And when the train stopped at Willesden Junction and the doors opened automatically, I walked out of the train. And then the doors closed and the train went away. And everyone who got off the train walked up a staircase and over a bridge except me. And then there were only two people that I could see. And one was a man, and he was drunk, and he had brown stains on his coat, and his shoes were not a pair, and he was singing, but I couldn't hear what he was singing. And the other was an Indian man in a shop, which was a little window in a wall. And I didn't want to walk to either of them because I was tired and hungry, and I had already talked to lots of strangers, which is dangerous. And the more you do something dangerous, the more likely it is that something bad happens. But I didn't know how to get to 451C Chapter Road, London, NW2 5NG, so I had to ask somebody. So I went up to the man in the little shop and I said, "Where is 451C Chapter Road, London, NW2 5NG?" And he picked up a little book and handed it to me and said, "295. And the book was called London AZ Street Atlas and Index, Geographer's A to Z Map Company. And I opened it up and it was lots of maps. And the man in the little shop said, "Are you going to buy it or not?" And I said, "I don't know." And he said, "Well, you can get your dirty fingers off if you don't mind." And he took it back from me. And I said, "Where is 451C Chapter Road, London, NW2 5NG? And he said, "You can either buy the A to Z or you can op it. I'm not a walking encyclopedia." And I said, "Is that the A to Z?" And I pointed at the book. And he said, "Nah, it's a sodden crocodile." And I said, "Is that the A to Z?" Because it wasn't a crocodile, and I thought I had heard wrong because of his accent. And he said, "Yeah, it's the A to Z." And I said, "Can I buy it?" And he didn't say anything. And I said, "Can I buy it?" And he said, £2.95, but you're giving me the money first. I'm not having you scarpering. And then I realised that he meant £2.95 when he said £2.95. And I paid him with my money, and he gave me change just like in the shop at home. And I went and sat down on the floor against the wall, like the man with the dirty clothes, but a long way away from him. And I opened up the book. And inside the front cover there was a big map of London, with places on it like Abbey Wood and Poplar and Acton and Stanmore. And it said Key to Map Pages, and the map was covered with a grid, and each square of the grid had two numbers on it. And Willesden was in the square which said 42 and 43. And I worked out that the numbers were the numbers of the pages where you could see a bigger scale map of that square of London. And the whole book was a big map of London, but it had been chopped up so it could be made into a book, and I liked that. But Willesden Junction wasn't on pages 42 and 43, and I found it on page 57, which was directly under page 42 on the Key to Map pages, and which joined up with page 42. And I looked round Willesden Junction in a spiral, like when I was looking for the train station in Swindon, but on the map with my finger. And the man who had shoes that did not match stood in front of me and said, "Big cheese, oh yeah, the nurses, never, bloody liar, total bloody liar." Then he went away. And it took me a long time to find Chapter Road because it wasn't on page 58, it was back on page 42, and it was in square 5C. And this was the shape of the roads between Willesden Junction and Chapter Road. And this was my route. So I went up the staircase and over the bridge, and I put my ticket in the little grey gate, and went into the street, and there was a bus and a big machine with a sign on it which said, English, Welsh, and Scottish Railways, but it was yellow, and I looked around and it was dark, and there were lots of bright lights, and I hadn't been outside for a long time, and it made me feel sick. And I kept my eyelids very close together, and I just looked at the shape of the roads, and then I knew which roads were Station Approach and Oak Lane, which were the roads I had to go along. So I started walking, but Siobhan said I didn't have to describe everything that happens. I just have to describe the things that were interesting. So I got to 451C Chapter Road, London NW2 5NG, and it took me 27 minutes, and there was no one in when I pressed the button that said Flat C. And the only interesting thing that happened on the way was 8 men dressed up in Viking costumes with helmets with horns on, and they were shouting, but they weren't real Vikings, because the Vikings lived nearly 2,000 years ago. And also I had to go for another wee, and I went in the alleyway down the side of a garage called Burdett Motors, which was closed, and I didn't like doing that, but I didn't want to wet myself again, and there was nothing else interesting. So I decided to wait, and I hoped that Mother was not on holiday, because that would mean she could be away for more than a whole week. But I tried not to think about this because I couldn't go back to Swindon. So I sat down on the ground behind the dustbins in the little garden that was in front of 451C Chapter Road, London NW2 5NG, and it was under a big bush. And a lady came into the garden, and she was carrying a little box with a metal grill on one end and a handle on the top like you use to take a cat to the vet. But I couldn't see if there was a cat in it. And she had shoes with high heels, and she didn't see me. And then it started to rain, and I got wet, and I started shivering because I was cold. And then it was 11:32 p.m., and I heard voices of people walking along the street. And a voice said, "I don't care whether you thought it was funny or not." And it was a lady's voice. And another voice said, "Judy, look, I'm sorry, okay?" And it was a man's voice. And the other voice, which was the lady's voice, said, "Well, perhaps you should have thought about that before you made me look like a complete idiot." And the lady's voice was Mother's voice. And Mother came into the garden, and Mr. Shears was with her, and the other voice was his. So I stood up and I said, "You weren't in, so I waited for you." And Mother said, "Christopher!" And Mr. Shears said, "What?" And Mother put her arms around me and said, "Christopher! Christopher! Christopher!" And I pushed her away because she was grabbing me and I didn't like it. And I pushed really hard and I fell over. And Mr. Shears said, "What the hell is going on?" And Mother said, "I'm so sorry, Christopher, I forgot." And I was lying on the ground, and Mother held up her right hand and spread her fingers out in a fan so that I could touch her fingers. But then I saw that Toby had escaped out of my pocket, so I had to catch him. And Mr. Shears said, "I suppose this means Ed's here." And there was a wall around the garden, so Toby couldn't get out because he was stuck in the corner and he couldn't climb up the walls fast enough. And I grabbed him and put him back in my pocket, and I said, "He's hungry. Have you got any food I can give him and some water?" And Mother said, "Where's your father, Christopher?" And I said, "I think he's in Swindon." And Mr. Shears said, "Thank God for that." And Mother said, how did you get here?" And my teeth were clicking against each other because of the cold, and I couldn't stop them. And I said, "I came on the train, and it was really frightening, and I took Father's cash point card so I could get money out, and a policeman helped me. But then he wanted to take me back to Father, and he was on the train with me, but then he wasn't." And Mother said, "Christopher, you're soaking. Roger, don't just stand there." And then she said, "Oh my God, Christopher, I didn't think I'd ever. Why are you here on your own?" And Mr. Shears said, "Are you going to come in or are you going to stay out here all night?" And I said, "I'm going to live with you because Father killed Wellington with a garden fork and I'm frightened of him." And Mr. Shears said, "Jumping Jack Christ." And Mother said, "Roger, please, come on, Christopher, let's get inside and get you dried off." So I stood up and I went inside the house, and Mother said, "You follow Roger." And I followed Mr. Shears up the stairs, and there was a landing and a door which said Flat C, and I was scared of going inside because I didn't know what was inside. And Mother said, "Go on or you'll catch your death." But I didn't know what "you'll catch your death" meant, and I went inside. And then she said, "I'll run you a bath." And I walked around the flat to make a map of it in my head so I felt safer. And the flat was like this. And then Mother made me take my clothes off and get into the bath, and she said I could use her towel, which was purple with green flowers on the end. And she gave Toby a saucer of water and some bran flakes, and I let him run around the bathroom. And he did 3 little poos under the sink, and I picked them up and flushed them down the toilet, and then I got back into the bath again because it was warm and nice. And Mother came into the bathroom, and she sat on the toilet and she said, "Are you okay, Christopher?" And I said, "I'm very tired." And she said, "I know, love." And then she said, "You're very brave." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "You never wrote to me." And I said, "I know." And she said, "Why didn't you write to me, Christopher? I wrote you all those letters. I kept thinking something dreadful had happened, or you'd moved away and I'd never find out where you were." And I said, "Father said you were dead." And she said, "What?" And I said, "He said that you went into hospital because you had something wrong with your heart. And then you had a heart attack and died, and he kept all the letters in a shirt box in the cupboard in his bedroom. And I found them because I was looking for a book I was writing about Wellington being killed, and he'd taken it away from me and hidden it in the shirt box." And then Mother said, "Oh my God!" And then she didn't say anything for a long while. And then she made a loud wailing noise like an animal on a nature program on television. And I didn't like her doing this because it was a loud noise. And I said, "Why are you doing that?" And she didn't say anything for a while. And then she said, "Oh, Christopher, I'm so sorry." And I said, "It's not your fault." And then she said, "Bastard, the bastard." And then after a while she said, "Christopher, let me hold your hand, just for once. Just for me, will you? I won't hold it hard." And she held out her hand. And I said, "I don't like people holding my hand." And she took her hand back and she said, "No, okay, that's okay." And then she said, "Let's get you out of the bath and dried off, okay?" And I got out of the bath and dried myself with the purple towel. But I didn't have any pajamas, so I put on a white t-shirt and a pair of yellow shorts, which were Mother's. But I didn't mind because I was so tired. And while I was doing this, Mother went into the kitchen and heated up some tomato soup because it was red. And then I heard someone opening the door of the flat, and there was a strange man's voice outside. So I locked the bathroom door. And there was an argument outside, and a man said, "I need to speak to him." And Mother said, "He's been through enough today already." And the man said, "I know, but I still need to speak to him." And Mother knocked on the door and said a policeman wanted to talk to me, and I had to open the door. And she said she wouldn't let him take me away, and she promised. So I picked Toby up and opened the door. And there was a policeman outside the door, and he said, "Are you Christopher Boone?" And I said I was. And he said, "Your father says you've run away. Is that right?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Is this your mother?" And he pointed at Mother. And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Why did you run away?" And I said, "Because Father killed Wellington, who is a dog, and I was frightened of him." And he said, "So I've been told." And then he said, "Do you want to go back to Swindon to your father, or do you want to stay here?" And I said, "I want to stay here." And he said, "And how do you feel about that?" And I said, "I want to stay here." And the policeman said, "Hang on, I'm asking your mother." And Mother said, "He told Christopher I was dead." And the policeman said, "Okay, let's not get into an argument about who said what here. I just want to know whether..." And Mother said, "Of course he can stay." And then the policeman said, "Well, I think that probably settles it as far as I'm concerned." And I said, "Are you going to take me back to Swindon?" And he said, "No." And then I was happy because I could live with Mother. And the policeman said, "If your husband turns up and causes any trouble, just give us a ring. Otherwise, you're going to have to sort this out between yourselves." And then the policeman went away, and I had my tomato soup, and Mr. Shears stacked up some boxes in the spare room so he could put a blow-up mattress on the floor for me to sleep on, and I went to sleep. And then I woke up because there were people shouting in the flat, and it was 2:31 a.m. And one of the people was Father, and I was frightened. But there wasn't a lock on the door of the spare room, and Father shouted, "I'm talking to her whether you like it or not, and I'm not going to be told what to do by you of all people." And Mother shouted, "Roger, don't, just..." And Mr. Shears shouted, "I'm not being spoken to like that in my own home." And Father shouted, "I'll talk to you how I damn well like." And Mother shouted, "You have no right to be here." And Father shouted, "No right? No right? He's my fucking son, in case you've forgotten." And Mother shouted, "What in God's name did you think you were playing at, saying those things to him?" And Father shouted, "What was I playing at? You were the one that bloody left." And Mother shouted, "So you decided to just wipe me out of his life altogether?" And Mr. Shears shouted, "Now let's all just calm down here, shall we?" And Father shouted, "Well, isn't that what you wanted?" And Mother shouted, "I wrote to him every week, every week." And Father shouted, "Wrote to him? What the fuck use is writing to him?" And Mr. Shears shouted, "Whoa, whoa, whoa." And Father shouted, "I cooked his meals, I cleaned his clothes, I looked after him every weekend. I looked after him when he was ill. I took him to the doctor. I worried myself sick every time he wandered off somewhere at night. I went to school every time he got into a fight. And you? What? You wrote him some fucking letters." And Father shouted, "So you thought it was okay to tell him that his mother was dead?" And Mr. Shears shouted, "Now is not the time." And Father shouted, "You butt out or I'll..." And Mother shouted, "Ed, for God's sake." And Father said, "I'm going to see him, and if you try to stop me..." And then Father came into my room, but I was holding my Swiss Army knife, and with the saw blade out in case he grabbed me. And Mother came into the room as well, and she said, "It's okay, Christopher. I won't let him do anything. You're all right." And Father bent down on his knees near the bed, and he said, "Christopher." But I didn't say anything. And he said, "Christopher, I'm really, really sorry about everything. About Wellington, about the letters, about making you run away. I never meant... I promise I will never do anything like that again. Hey, come on, kiddo." And then he held up his right hand and spread his fingers out in a fan so that I could touch his fingers. But I didn't because I was frightened. And Father said, "Shit, Christopher, please." And there were tears dripping off his face. And no one said anything for a while. And then Mother said, "I think you should go now." But she was talking to Father, not me. And then the policeman came back because Mr. Shears had rung the police station and he had told Father to calm down, and he took him out of the flat. And Mother said, "You go back to sleep now. Everything is going to be all right, I promise." And then I went back to sleep.